Welcome to Work Life by Design. I'm your host, Mel Marsden. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that change is inevitable and we no longer need to go to work to work. As a workplace dynamic strategist and the founder of Community, I draw back the curtains on my own business, the clients and projects that we deliver, along with tapping into the knowledge and insights from academics, business leaders and champions of change. I believe that our environments have the power to positively influence our behaviour and performance, inspiring our human potential. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Work Life by Design. Now today you are tuning into the fourth episode in my 6-part series where I take you on tour with me as we're celebrating the launch of my book, The Next Workplace, Designing Dynamic Environments that Inspire Human Potential. So to celebrate the release of the book, I took the book on tour. We started off in Brisbane, we then headed to Melbourne, and we ended up in Sydney. And as I said, today is the fourth part in that 6-part series, and it is our second half of our conversation from the Melbourne launch. So I kicked off the conversation with my panellists, and we dove into the discussion on all things work, people, and place by looking at whether or not the old metrics of a desk for a person and if they still apply. As we are all navigating a very new frontier of work, what are the right metrics? So for this conversation, I was joined by Jacqui Whiteman, the Chief Operating Officer at Davidson, Kylie Baullo, the Managing Director at ADP, Petrina Stewart, the People and Inclusion Lead at KPMG, and Dan Mottau, Global Director of Organisational Development and Learning. So we explored a range of topics from what is the right approach for organisations to take when thinking about creating a new workplace, through to leveraging your workplace as a key asset in your employee experience value proposition, through to the roles that your workplace plays in creating belonging, supporting diversity and inclusivity. This was a conversation that had the audience engaged and jumping in with questions, and we could have talked for hours. So with each of our panellists sharing their experiences of rethinking work, the workplace and the whole experience of work, this conversation is sure to leave you with a lot to think about. So if you missed the first part of our Melbourne conversation, this is where I was interviewing Jacqui Whiteman on how the team at Community and I worked with Davidson to reimagine their next workplace in both Brisbane and in Melbourne. So if you haven't tuned into that one, head back a week and listen to that. And if you have missed the Brisbane ones, head back to those as well. And next week, we'll be heading off to Sydney where we'll kick off the conversations there before wrapping it up with our 6-part series. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you're enjoying this series, please share it with someone else so that we can all start to elevate our experience of work. But without any further ado, please let me introduce you, Jacqui, Kylie, Petrina, and Dan. Now I'm going to invite to join us up here the rest of our speakers for this evening. So firstly, I would like to invite Kylie Baullo from the Managing Director, the Australia New Zealand of ADP. So Kylie joined ADP back in 1991 and early last year was actually appointed as the Managing Director for Australia and New Zealand. So congratulations.
Yes, thank you very much.
So ADP, for those of you who don't know, are a global payroll services company with locations in 140 countries. So prior to taking on her current position, Kylie was actually the VP of Client Services in Asia Pacific, leading the operational excellence and business transformation. Prior to this, she also led ADP's global operations for their multinational business unit, responsible for servicing strategy, business transformation, compliance, and project portfolio management. This has seen Kylie and her family travel the world and experiencing different cultures, living in Barcelona, Spain since 2013 before returning to Australia in 2018. So Kylie brings a global and forward-thinking perspective to the concept of work and workplace design. So thank you for joining us, Kylie.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Next, I would like to welcome Petrina Stewart. So Petrina is the People and Inclusion Lead for KPMG's Enabling Services. So Petrina has over 20 years' experience collaborating with business leaders, design strategies and achieve the best solutions for their people. As a true generalist, this includes, but is not limited to, talent attraction, employee onboarding, induction, performance management, learning, inclusion, wellbeing, reward and recognition, communication, employee relations, and of course, workplace flexibility. So Petrina is a chartered member of AHARI and holds a Bachelor of Social Science for Business and Psychology. In life, Petrina values balance, and this includes balancing a love of fitness with food and fun, and importantly, balancing her busy job with an even busier 3-year-old. I can relate.
So Petrina lives in Melbourne with her husband, Trent, and son, Jimmy, and enjoys escaping with them to Lorne or to visit family on the Gold Coast whenever possible, which the weather is way better up in Queensland.
I can imagine.
Melbourne. But I'm really looking forward to Petrina sharing her thoughts tonight. So welcome, Petrina.
Thank you very much.
And last but not least, we have Dan Mottau. So Dan is a senior people, organisational development, learning and communications leader who enjoys examining the underlying motivations and patterns of thinking that elicit, amplifying and diminishing behaviours within and between teams. So his approach is heavily influenced by behavioural psychology and anthropology, especially as their principles may be applied to team functioning and the cultivation and sustainment of psychological safety and high performance. Dan's passion is for accelerating the growth of leaders and for increasing their personal impact through the success of their people. His teams deliver expert talent, organisational development and people partnering outcomes by delivering best fit solutions that are supported by data, that are deeply sensitive to organisational memory, underlining cultures, workplace and people experiences. Dan was actually introduced to me by a mutual colleague, and from our first conversation, I've been extremely excited about him joining us here tonight. He's going to share his experiences connecting that concept of work to place and his insights from developing the ways of working strategies at Redbubble and how they then inform the design of the workplace. So I'm pretty excited about that. We also both have 4.5-year-olds and babies, so we have a lot in common. So I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say tonight. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
So look, designing and building a workplace is a big undertaking for any organisation. And the whole reason that I've become so passionate about workplace design is really because of the strategic approach that I've been able to develop. And that's really been because I was so frustrated with organisations coming to me and going, I have X amount of employees and I have leased a box and I want to fit X amount of employees in there by giving everyone a desk. And, you know, that brief was so limiting. I didn't know anything about those organisations. I knew nothing about what they did. I didn't know how to bring anything to it other than a spatial planning capability. And there's so much more to workplaces. There's so much more to businesses. And I really wanted to understand how I could bring more value to the work that I did for those organisations and really enhance their organisation as a result of the workplace that we delivered for them. And I really had no understanding of what they did or how they functioned, what then people actually needed to do to perform, or, you know, the spaces that I could provide to support them in performing. COVID brought about many, many bad things, but I think one of the great things that has come about as a result of this is the ability for organisations to start asking different questions, to start looking at their workplaces differently and to really understand where that opportunity lies. And as organisations are really struggling to navigate that, those old metrics are really no longer applying. And it's really not just a desk for a person anymore. It's really about understanding what that organisation needs to attract the best talent, to retain the best talent and what they're going to need to perform. And so before organisations jump straight into designing a workplace, we really first need to understand how that business works and what is the work that needs to be done so that that workplace can then be designed accordingly and it can become a framework that enables that business to really perform. And so I think that starts to pose my first question. In your view, what is an office for today? And I'm going to start with you, Dan, on the other end, and then we're going to work our way along the couch.
It's such a big question, but I think I'll give it an overly simplistic answer, which is the office needs to be what N=1 requires in the moment on the day. And what I mean by that, and it goes back to some of Jacqui's earlier comments, is that if we think of what offices were, even going back to the start of my career, it was a space you fit yourself into. Whatever it was you had for that day, whatever task it was you're engaging in, you had your space to be in. I think the most exciting thing that's changing is a lot of what we're offering now is choice. So I think fundamentally the word is choice. It allows each person, for the most part, and within reason, to decide what the place is best for them on that given day, whether that be at home, another remote location, or at the workplace itself. But even within the space, it allows them freedom of choice between specific spaces within the office. Is it a space they need in that moment that is focused? It is somewhat isolated, giving them that ability to reflect and think and be in their own head. Is it a space that is more collaborative and built for collaboration? Does it have the technical ability to help people collaborate, whether they're all together co-located or whether they are in mixed locations? And a lot of our businesses are across multiple geographies. So you have to factor in that not everyone's always going to be in that room. And are there spaces that are genuinely social? Which is that we've been through COVID and we've spent so much time alone in some states and cities and countries more than others. And people do just have that fundamental need for human connection. And do the spaces meet those three principles of focus, collaboration, and socialization? And how do we do that through choice, which enables N equal 1 to make the decision that's best for them and their performance?
Yeah, that's a really good reflection. I like that. Thank you, Jen. Petrina, what have you got to add to that?
I would agree to it. I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve from a cultural point of view with your organisation and also what you value as an organisation. So I'm at KPMG. We want a culture where our people feel trusted to make that choice in the morning, to get out of bed and say, okay, I've got this to do today. Where's going to be the best place for me to achieve that? And then for them to go about it. And our hybrid working model includes, working from home, working from the office hub or the client hub, and then a variety of different spaces from our office. So what we found is people primarily come into the office for 4 reasons. Either they're new and it's an orientation or an induction piece that they're going through where they're getting to know and learn, or they're further on down the path and they're learning from others either, in the flow of work or in a structured way. To, of course, collaborate on problems, projects, or to connect socially. So it's less about doing the work and more connecting with the people around you that you work with, which is really lovely. What we have found is it's not without its challenges. So we've had to really, lean into difficult conversations with leaders that have tried to mandate a return to office because the work doesn't all need to be done in the office, as we know. Well, we can see some real benefit in people coming into the office and using the beautiful spaces that we've got to connect together.
Yeah, so it's really about shifting, why are we coming in here? What are we doing when we're getting here?
That's right. And also then providing the permission for people to use the office in the way that it's intended to be used and not kind of mandate that return.
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation in itself, is about highlighting to people the permissions that they're allowed to use the space in different ways to suit their needs, that, you're not just to come in and have to sit at a workstation all day, that you have this whole variety of space to be able to utilise. So that in itself, I think, is an interesting proposition for employees in some organisations. And how about you, Kylie? How are you seeing the purpose of the office?
Yeah, so I'm going to probably extend a little to the whole theme of being connected and the ability for people to work closer together. ADP, easy way to remember us, always designing for people, and people are at the centre of what we do, right? So we're a tech company that really is focused on making sure that the humans are inside everything that we do. And so we are one of those organisations that have had a mandate globally. So you mentioned 60,000 employees worldwide, and we're about 3-2 because we see the importance of creating those connections. Now, that 3-2 might be different for different teams in different countries and different locations, but the office is about getting back to teams and back to clients for us. And so that ability to do things in a common space is so critical. And we've done a lot during COVID, like everyone has. We all went online and absolutely were able to get by. What we're seeing is the speed of innovation when we have that connection and the ability to be in the same airspace is really accelerated.
So it's really about thinking about putting people back at the centre of everything.
Yeah.
Instead of, this is a space and cramming people into it.
That's
and as you
right.
said, fitting people into it.
That's right.
And how about you, Jacqui?
I think all the same, agreed. I think the only thing I'd add is the joining of the dots.
Yep.
By having people back in each other together. You might miss certain things when you're on the teams or working remotely. That's probably the only addition that I would add as well that I'm seeing is the joining of, Jacqui knows that person. Oh, great. Didn't know that Jacqui knew that person. Or you're hearing a conversation that's overhearing it and you're thinking, oh, hang on a second. I've been trying to get into that client. So it's very similar to what Kylie was saying, but that's the only thing that I would add that we haven't already covered.
So that network of relationships and how that can be leveraged then to support existing relationships with clients and, diversification of business then as well.
And learning. You've got to constantly be evolving and learning and going back to innovation, and everything's moving so quickly that people are just learning on the go. So coming back together allows you to sort of stop and breathe and have you learnt the right process or should we be looking at that process?
So observing how people are actually working and what's going on and where those sticky points are. And I think that's an interesting proposition because, not one of those answers that we got there was really about coming in to sit at my desk every day and stare at my 2 screens. So that kind of leads me into my next question. If we're going to be looking at going out to market or looking at the amount of space that our organisations are taking up, those metrics are no longer the same metrics. As I mentioned before, I had 100 people, I needed to put 100 desks in and, there was a square ratio that went with that and off we went. That's changed. And so I have a view on how organisations should be approaching this, but I'm keen to understand how you feel organisations could be approaching this in terms of, if we're going back to market and we need to be taking on an amount of space and we need to know what shape and size building we need to be leasing, what are the fundamental things that organisations should be really considering before making those really big ticket decisions? Because, once you've committed to a lease, you're locked in for, not just 5 years when we're signing that lease originally, because then that has your renewal period that comes after that. So we're looking at minimum 10 years that these organisations are locked into these. And as a financial decision, which often sits with us in the CFO's bucket, they're going, oh, well, we need about this much space based on what we've currently got, and I'm just going to go to market, I'm going to get the best deal I can on a square meterage rate. And they're not really thinking about the impact of that decision from another couple of angles. And I think there's opportunity in there. So I'd really be interested in your perspective on, what do you really believe creates a robust process for organisations in getting this right? And I know, Kylie, you and I have had this conversation recently, so I'm going to throw this one to you first up.
Well, I think, I was explaining, I take a lot of inspiration from what we've done at ADP in the Netherlands. So back in 2017, before pandemic hit, one of the key things they were looking at is how to be more sustainable. And they went to what's the culture and ethos that we want to create before they look at the floor print. And I have to say, first and foremost, we are, very numbers orientated at ADP. We're quite a conservative organisation. And so what they started out with is how are we able to bring sustainability into the core of what we do, because that's the right thing to do for us and particularly in the Netherlands. For anyone who's been there, they know it's a very mindful country in terms of their impact on the earth. And so we're starting from that, worked backwards and said, okay, we want to make sure that we can have places for electric vehicles and solar. And so they started with a conversation internally about sustainability and then said, how can we fit that into the budget? How can we fit that into the space? And then started talking about how work is designed. And I think that the next step, and I'm sure with all of the wonderful insights we've got here, we've got lots of conversations around how work is done and how to better understand work. But the thing I loved about the Netherlands, and I can say now, after visiting and the ethos they continue, is it's not just what we do at the start of the program. They are continuing to refine their entire footprint on what more can we do.
Yeah. So it's not just done and here we go and that's it, just our hands. It's that iterative process of continual improvement that comes with that.
Yep.
And I think, Dan, this is a timely segue for you to carry on in terms of looking at the design of work, because that's exactly how you started with the conversation at Redbubble. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, so I joined Redbubble in January 2020, and we were actually at the start of tendering for 2 new offices, one in Melbourne, one in Berlin, and we were preparing for a major refurbishment of our spaces in San Francisco. Almost well-timed in a sense that what I think COVID did broadly was accelerate some changes that we already knew were coming, which was people already were demanding more flexibility. People were already demanding certain behaviours and preferences for working. I think, if anything, COVID just sped that up significantly and proved to the world that we could do it. That sort of helped inform much of what our strategy became. So before we started engaging in real estate and looking at floor plates, before we started looking at even strategy firms to help us support the design of those spaces, we just fundamentally asked ourselves dozens of design questions. And the first ones that sort of come to mind were the most influential, I suppose, on the choices we made, which were, are we a remote-first organisation? And what comfort do we have with people being in or out of the office a certain number of days a week? I know I mentioned at the start, leave it to the N=1, but as others have already commented too, there are really powerful learning opportunities, connecting communication opportunities by being physically together with people. The way we interact is different in person than it is virtually. So we had a list of dozens of these design questions to help inform what we called our working places and spaces strategy would become. They really started with behaviours, which was first and foremost, how do we expect our people to behave in this new working world? How often do we expect them to come in versus how often do we want them to come in? And do those things marry up or not? And is that a problem? Happily for us in that instance, where we landed was about where everyone wanted it and maximum choice as best it could be. The second big piece for us was just fundamentally deciding upon that question of what will these spaces just do? And speaking of where the CFO's voice came in, we had a very interesting project group, which was actually led by our head of belonging for this exercise. And that actually fundamentally changed what we were doing in the approach. One of the key pillars was inclusivity by design, was a key pillar to our work. And that was obviously thinking around that was led by our project lead, who was the head of belonging at Redbubble. Our CFO was also a member of the group and not a conservative CFO by any measure. And that was obviously a lot of fun.
Helps.
What we ended up coming to after all these design decisions and what we had the space at the time versus what we needed was a reduction in space, which delighted the CFO. Also market conditions where the prices for leasing were significantly less. So there were huge money saves. And when we pumped that was to soundscaping. It was to that community building element in the space. So I know I've gone slightly off your key question, but it was fundamentally about designing for belonging and community and making sure those design decisions were really clear before we got anywhere near a conversation about floor plates and spaces and available tenancies.
I love that you guys started there. And, you know, when you and I first spoke, I got so excited because I'm like, speaks my language. And the fact that you guys started with actually thinking about what kind of company are we? Are we remote first? Are we in person? What is the drivers for this workplace? And I think that's an opportunity that so many businesses miss. And I'm going to throw to you now, Jacqui, because you had the good fortune, I suppose, with Melbourne to come in, you know, post-Brisbane with a completely different set of fresh eyes and look at this. And I think the brief even for Melbourne was very different when we started that conversation. So how did that shift for you in terms of what the purpose of the workplace actually needed to fill?
Yeah, so I guess we had two different cultures. So the Brisbane culture and the Melbourne culture were really different. We were quite flexible already in Melbourne, where Brisbane, we hadn't embraced it. So Brisbane was going through a whole different journey, where Melbourne, we were getting more and more, like what Dan mentioned around pre-COVID, still asking for that flexibility. So we were really looking for a space that brought us together. So Melbourne, we had 3 business lines and we were soloed. We were known as us and them, where our offices were. So the tech business was us and the search business was them. So for us around Melbourne, it was, well, how do we remove that barrier? Because Brisbane had a lot of that, but not as much as what Melbourne did. But flexibility was also, we had a lot of empty space in our Melbourne office, as we still do today, because it just wasn't positioned right. So when you talk about floor plates and size, we thought we would need more space. We're going back to what I said originally, we're just having the same space, which means we're not spending as much as we would have in the original quote. So CFO, who's now our CEO, is happy. So for us, it was more about how do we actually leverage the great work that we do and stop being us versus them. We were in the market as 3 different businesses as well. So we really just wanted to bring that to life and become one Davidson.
So that consolidation of business. Yeah. And Petrina, have you got anything you want to add to that in terms of?
No, I've not been involved in a project like that, so I'm going to say no.
You've got other very interesting things to contribute, so don't worry. And this is one I know that you will be able to definitely answer. Is in the book, I've dedicated a whole chapter to creating employee experience, which arguably the whole book is actually about it, because that's what workplace design, in my view, is actually about, is creating a really great employee experience. And I'd be interested to understand from your perspective, how do you feel that the workplace is actually an employee value proposition? How is it supporting those individual needs? And you touched on it a little bit, Dan, in terms of that belonging piece, but people's personal preferences for working styles, that multiple generations, I've already referred to that a little bit with the conversation for Davidson earlier, or particular individual sensitivities. And designing for neurodiversity is becoming something that's a lot more spoken about now. I think it's a lot more recognised. How are you seeing workplaces changing? And I'm going to start with you, Petrina, because I know that you guys have already created a workplace that embraces all of this.
We have, and I think it really lends to the inclusion piece that, you know, having a head of belonging on the project, what that person probably brought. But we've just opened our Parramatta office, and the massive amount of work that went into the core design principles all being around inclusion is quite amazing, and it's something that I'm quite proud of. So, for example, the team understood from the local elders what the story of the area was. That's beautifully articulated within the office itself. There's beautiful murals from First Nations artists from around the high schools and universities in the area. There is a reflection room that has foot baths, and it's not for pedicures, it's for people that want to clean their feet before they pray. For the mums, there is somewhere that they can express that is quiet, and it's not a meeting room, and it has a fridge. So everybody's circumstances have been taken into consideration, as well as being super fun, ping pong tables, PlayStation rooms. So there's a real reason, you know, of connectivity to come in and have fun with your colleagues, but also always feel included and that you've been thought of before you turn up to the office in Parramatta. The other part of the EVP for KPMG is that we do really value that flexibility piece. So we might have people that will receive a higher offer down the road, but they'll say, no, actually, I value the flexibility of KPMG and that my manager and leaders trust me to do my work in the way that I see fit. So that for us, I think, is we call it our people promise, or our EVP around those two areas, around flexibility and also inclusion.
Yeah, so it's really driving that employee retention as well.
That's it.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And how about you, Kylie? What are you seeing there in terms of employee value proposition from a workplace perspective?
Really, it's about bringing a number of different components together. So it's really a convergence of different aspects of the workplace. I think irrespective of the EVP and the organisation that you have, one of these core components is really on how you're approaching the dialogue with your workforce. And again, from a global lens, one of the things I've seen coming back to Australia is change is tougher here than many countries. I'm not sure why. I'm sure there's a scientific way around it. I think we love new gadgets, and on a personal level, we like to do new things. Richard and I were talking about this earlier, but there is an element of, resistance to change. And so I think part of the journey of personalising and thinking of associates, employees before they come to work and designing places where people want to go to is a big component about how you drive successful change. And so whilst I think at ADP some of the things that are core to us and what we think are core to our associates, we have quite an aged population. So that's for us, it's what's the future of the workforce and how do we attract younger talent whilst maintaining a fabulous tenure. But for me, it's around just getting that right balance with the dialogue of change. And I'm not saying we have done that yet in Australia. I look to the other countries at ADP that have been very successful at doing that. And I mentioned the Netherlands, but Tunisia and the UK and also in Italy. Some of the things that we've done in those locations just wouldn't fly here. And so that level of consultation and involvement and engagement. And I think it's one of the things I loved about our conversation also. You call it out. You say what works and what do you have in your home life, what do you have in your work life, and how do you bring those things together in a way where someone actually feels like they've been thought of. Right? So for me, I think it's about the consultation process. Sorry if I offended anyone with that. But I think here in Australia, we have a very specific culture you've got to work with.
Can you just elaborate just a little bit about what differences between Australia and the Netherlands and Italy and Tunisia and the changes that they have made that you have just said it just wouldn't fly here? What are those things?
I think things take longer. Let me put Japan as an outlier out there, okay? So Japan is not one that I would put in that basket. But if I look particularly at the European counterparts, maybe in places like Germany and the Netherlands where the Workers' Council are quite present, employees are used to having a voice and having a dialogue and a way to collaborate. I think in the Netherlands, part of their culture is there's no wallflowers here, everyone speaks their mind. And so there is a baseline culture where this communication and dialogue makes things faster. Again, I started out with I'm not yet sure why it's different here. I don't understand that mechanism, but what I do know is those conversations seem to take longer. We look for consensus far more. And I'm not just saying it's at ADP. I see this in our clients. And, it does take a lot longer, that consensus. And then you realise, well, after you've got the consensus, has that just made the idea mediocre? Because everyone now agrees on it. But is that actually a good idea? Or was the guy who just said, this is the way we should go in the first instance, and no one wanted to agree with that person because that was the first person to say it, actually probably had a great idea.
And you know what happens when we design by committee? Instead of getting a horse, we get a camel, which is what is going to happen. And just to put some context around that conversation, the conversation that you and I had was around the ability to manage change and to support change. And a big part of what I do in facilitating these conversations in organisations is to hear all of the reasons why we can't do this. Like, why is this not going to be possible? And, the whole calling bullshit on it was basically me going, okay, tell me all your reasons and then I'm going to tell you why this is actually possible and talk you down off your ledge. And some of those examples are around understanding. People bring up excuses that aren't actually the real reason why they don't want to change something. So they'll have all of these sort of fence posts around the outside and it's breaking them down to get to the core of what the real problem is. And once you can resolve that, change becomes easy because they're like, oh, you've dealt with all my needs, I'm cool now, and off you go. So a big part of, and particularly in the world that we're living in now, is change management. It's a huge part of the process because we're not doing anything the way that we've always done it. We're really bringing people on a different journey. And so having those conversations and calling the bullshit.
It's helpful when you're doing that with an external party that has done this before and that brings a level of expertise. To be honest, Melissa, I think one of the things that impressed me was just in all of the projects that you've worked on, you have developed the talk track that frankly as an employer, I wouldn't know where to start. And in looking at Australia in a little bit of a unique situation in terms of that change management, working with experts in that respect, for me, just adds a whole different dimension in terms of speed and the ability to execute.
You've got a different perspective. You've got a different lens coming in, so it changes things. Yeah, absolutely. And how about you, Jacqui? What do you got to add?
We would never have envisaged what we have now, so we would never have got there on our own. I love the fact they say to call the bullshit, but the delays, everyone's got an opinion and nothing really gets done. But what I loved was that execution of being able to say, this is what you're trying to achieve, this is what we think is going to work for you, and it's working for us. I think at the time it was a concept that not many of us wanted to support because we weren't ready. And in the end, we pulled the trigger and it's fantastic. We're 3 years on and we're probably thinking, what's next? How do we evolve that environment again? So completely agree around it was the best thing that we did, and we would not have got there without that support and that help to really unpack what was our culture, what is the change that we're trying to make, and what do we want to get out of this for our employees, which for us, it's not just about growth and about being successful. It's about retaining people and coming to work, have fun, but also be happy in what you do.
And contributing back into the business at the same time. Yeah. And Dan, your perspective on this, like employee value proposition has obviously been a big part of that whole conversation and the work that you're doing. Whatever you want to add?
Yeah, there were two lenses when I think of the work we did at Redbubble. The first was focused on retention and the second on attraction. On the front of retention, it was a question of location strategy, which was, are these spaces accessible? Will people want to come to this place? And we were looking at locations in South Melbourne, in Collingwood, very trendy spaces, multi-level with mezzanines, very artistic, which is very much in tune with the brand of the company. And we were looking Melbourne CBD as well, and even beyond Hawthorn and other areas too. And what we did, we actually took from the HRS every employee's address and we mapped it. And we figured out the implication of that choice upon their transit and their day and their experience. And then we overlaid a question, which we couldn't answer, but we supposed, if people were only coming in 1 or 2 days a week, how might that affect their feeling of coming to a space that is slightly less or more convenient for them? Ultimately, what we decided on for the retention, one of the many factors for retention, was that we would build a space that was as central and accessible as possible. And we chose 2 Melbourne Quarter, directly across from Southern Cross Station. You can't have a more accessible location than that. And that also obviously answers for attraction too. Knowing the venue is so accessible is a huge plus. The other piece I'll share, just the other second piece, is just around the sense of how the space makes you feel. And a big part of the EVP for us was when we have these moments to come together, we want to really achieve 2 things. One, we want to make you feel like you're at home and belong there, like it's an extension of your kitchen table, and wherever you might find yourself, you feel comfortable, even with the fabrics that you touch and the space that you find yourself in. And the second is, how do we imprint the brand upon people as they enter the space to reinforce that decision? I'm at Redbubble, holy shit, Redbubble's cool. Obviously for Redbubble, we have tens and hundreds of millions of pieces of artistry on the marketplace, including custom works that our staff do as part of their own work or passions on the site, and they sell it through that marketplace too. So if anyone has the pleasure of going into that beautiful space at 2MQ, it is plastered from ceiling to floor with unique artistry. The only thing I'll add to that is the art chosen for those spaces is very unique to the use of the space too. So the furnishings, the actual soundscaping, the acoustics, the particular mural, the attitude of the mural, the feeling it unconsciously puts you in is specifically chosen and curated to bring out a particular emotion. And that informs 2 things. One, again, holy shit, this is a cool place to work. I'm going to keep coming back to this office. But also number 2, the actual use of that particular space in that place and how it informs the way you use it. So I'll just tack that on the end there as well.
I love that. So brand experience is a huge part of that whole employee value proposition. And I love how you mentioned it. It's that whole, how do I make you feel when you come in here? And it's so consciously done and so deliberately infused, because I think a lot of organisations miss that opportunity and it just becomes a bit, we stuck that on the wall because it looked pretty, or there's no real underlying conscious thought that goes with that. So I think that's really, really cool. And that location strategy is also really important, because when you said the accessibility piece, it really needs to be centralised and easy to get to. So I think there's a few layers in what you said there that are very much on the mark around how we can create an employee value proposition that really wants to draw people into that organisation.
Enjoying the episode? I would love it if you would share this show with just one person who you think it would inspire. Just one. The more we can share the insights of what it takes to make work work, the closer we are to elevating everyone's experience of work.
Now, my final question for tonight, because we've spoken about belonging and inclusivity a few times throughout the panel already tonight, but it is a conversation that's been discussed a lot more in our organisations now, at workplace conferences, everywhere I go, this is a conversation that's coming up. And I love Brené Brown's perspective on this, and it's that through her research, she's found that, you know, the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And I think that was already mentioned tonight is, you know, we just fit ourselves into the space because that's the space that's been provided. Essentially what's happening then is you're not being your true authentic self, is you're figuring out who you need to be accepted in this crowd. And I think that in our workplaces, being able to really express who we are and build that brand experience so that you have a sense of who you are when you walk in the door, that's about enabling people to really identify, do I belong here? Is this my place? Am I going to fit in with these people, but fit in a good way because these are my people? As opposed to, you know, we come in and it's white walls and white doors and, you know, we go, okay, well, I have no idea what these people do, or are these my people or not? You know, I think that's changing that whole sense of identity around our workplaces, and essentially for our people is our parting question. How do you see the workplace as having a potential to really get this right as we're going through? And I'm going to start from this end of the couch and work our way along.
Oh, I think it's a really tricky question because we're probably not as advanced as some of the other wonderful panellists today. I don't believe we've got all the answers yet. As we continue to diversify our business, I don't think as a senior leadership team that we're sitting there asking ourselves every day, are we being inclusive? The decisions that we make, and I'll go back to me being cheeky around the shorts and the thongs, that's important to some of our staff members now, that they want to feel welcomed and come into the office like that. So for me, I think we've still got a long way to go. One, if we want to continue to attract the new cohort of employees, and I don't mean that from a generation, I just mean that by changing mindsets and get different opinions and different people working for us to help grow. We've got some more work to do. I think Brisbane looks fantastic. We've now got a ACT office, we've got a South Australian office, Sydney's grown, it's doubled, and we've got Melbourne. So we've got a diverse bunch of people that we need to accommodate, and I think we've only probably looked at 80% of it and need to constantly be looking at it. And we're busy people, but we come back to enhancing workplace performance. So we need to hold ourselves to account every day when we're getting together as a leadership team to make sure that we're actually doing that for our staff before we're doing it for our clients. So I won't say we have all the answers, no way. I think we're probably 60, 70% there, but we've got some work to do. And we need to use the Melbourne new office to help come out of the pandemic life, and what does life look like now? What is it all about for us? But we need to have inclusivity as the number one. You know, even talking to Petrina before about the neuro, have we thought about that in our business? Yes, we have, but have we adopted the working style to enable that person to be successful? No, we would be being reactive if someone came to us and said, I want to work with you, but I have these needs. We would be literally saying, right, let's jump on the bandwagon here and make this happen. Yeah. So we've got some work to do.
Yeah, it's consciously aware of that though. So it's going to be something that's forefront for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
Okay.
I think from an ADP lens, we've got a long history of working on what we would call business resource groups. I know it's a very American term, but effectively it's community groups, grassroots community groups. And we have these globally in every location. When you go in, you know where you're landing in terms of a country that's focused on pride or that's focused on looking at a wide variety of different community interests based on where you're at. What we haven't done so well or yet in Australia is give it a canvas and a place to come together. And this is where I think the exciting, well, I suppose for us here in this location, is the next step in the journey, is being able to almost do, you were mentioning the smoking circle or the ability to come
circle.
Is the ability for those groups to actually physically come together. Because a lot of what we've been doing so far has been remote, it's been online and sharing thoughts about communities without as much human connection. And I think as we start to launch now into our next phase where we bring people into collaborating around what should be the workspace, we have those backdrops of those communities and we have a very strong sense of belonging as it relates to that. We just don't have a workplace that can bring it together.
Yeah, that's that foundational glue piece that's really missing, the physical structure.
Yes. Yeah. So I think for us, it's a work in progress for sure, but we've started out probably because it's been very globally driven in terms of these structures and most of it's been online. And I think that the next step is to getting a little bit more human.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Petrina.
I think the physical space is really important in terms of inclusion, but I think more than anything, it's around leadership attitudes and really that understanding and education. And I think we're going to have a beautiful space in Parramatta. The Melbourne office will continue to improve, but it's really about pulling people's hearts and minds into why inclusion is important for diversity of thought, but just for having a better world, really. So it's a big journey and it's multifaceted, and there are so many different people that come with from different walks of life, to KPMG and offer so much. So it's really about keeping them all there and keeping them happy and hoping that we connect with them, I think, in the office.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Cute. And Dan?
Yeah, Petrina's just jumped on my favourite points.
Stole your thoughts.
So I might not add much value at this point. So there's 2 points that come to mind, and I'm reiterating much of what Petrina said in 2 of your previous answers too, which is there's the inclusivity piece, which is inclusivity by design, and there's belonging, which requires inclusivity first, but then emotional well-being. So the points that I'd add very briefly are, for inclusivities by design, it's around, does the space welcome people equally or meet the needs of individuals? So there are elements around particular facilities, particular accessibility requirements, and it's not just about who we have here today, it's who might we have tomorrow, and how will this space ensure they are included as equally or as best we can. We're not going to meet all things all the time, but we do our absolute best to design with inclusivity first and foremost. Belonging's a bit more complex and complicated, but it does require inclusivity first, and then we move to emotional wellbeing. And what we studied and looked at for Redbubble specifically is when people are well, how do they perform? And what are the ingredients for people being well? And leadership behaviour was at the heart of it, which is you can have the best location strategy in the world, you can have the best places and spaces strategy in the world, you have the best offices with all the brand and the feels, you can have all the tech stack and the technology, all the art. I'll call it out, Redbubble had all the best tech you can imagine for this stuff. We had all the right tools and platforms. Connecting remotely or hybrid was not an issue. But fundamentally, if a people manager puts a barrier in your way, you're stuffed. And that might not affect everyone, but it will affect a group of people and the way they show up and the way they experience that space. So I think, there's all of the physical spaces, but it all gets undone very quickly by mindset. If I actually look at the list of the strategy pieces we had, number one on that strategy was leadership behaviour. And that actually came before everything else, because we knew that if the behaviours weren't right, if manager hygiene and the basic behaviours of people management weren't right, if the mindsets and philosophies weren't understood, it would all unravel.
Yeah, and I have to agree that that's what I'm seeing in a lot of organisations as well, is really getting that designer work right, and then understanding what are the expertise that we need to have, what is the capabilities that our people, managers need to have to be able to support that, because without that it all falls apart. So yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I'm going to wrap it up there. We will be hanging around, so please come and have a chat. There's plenty of food and drink, so I really encourage people to hang around. But tonight would not have been possible without some very special people supporting me. So I really want to say thank you to my panellists tonight for joining me, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your experience. It's really been a fantastic conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And, it's been a great opportunity to work alongside yourself, Jacqui, and to really get to know you guys as well through this whole process. It's been really interesting hearing the different journeys that you've gone on and where you're heading. So thank you very much, guys. It's been wonderful. Thank you. So give them a hand. I'd really like to say thank you to Stylecraft as well. You guys have been incredible help today setting up, but also just offering us your beautiful space here tonight. It's very on brand. So thank you. It's gorgeous.
It is.
Thank you. Stylecraft have been a big supporter of mine for a very, very long time, back to your very early days starting out, and their furniture features quite heavily in the work that I do, so it's very fitting that we're having tonight here, so thank you guys. And then I'd really like to extend a very heartfelt thank you to anyone who supported me along this journey. So I've embraced a number of people to read parts of my book, to bounce ideas off, to really kind of get my thoughts together around what I'm going to be putting into writing, because it's all well and good for me to sit here and think these things and to say these things, but to put them into writing, they're baked in there now. So testing those theories, making sure they're sane before I put them into writing has been a big part of this process. And so that's given me a lot of confidence to put everything that I have into that book tonight. So to those people, and Annetta is one of those people who's contributed to that, so thank you very much to those people as well. But I'd also really like to thank each one of my clients who have entrusted myself and the team at Community to deliver their projects, and for those then who have enabled me to share their stories in the book, such as Davidson, so thank you. I'd love to thank everyone for coming along tonight, for supporting the launch of my book. It's a pretty exciting process to go through and write a book. I'm not sure I'm going to do it again, so we're going to make the most of this opportunity. But also, for sharing insights and the learnings, and hopefully that, you take these things away tonight and you can embed them back in your own organisations, and together we can all start to elevate that whole experience of work. But I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.